we exploit that miniaturization to allow us to go and work better with the collections, since they're not just small pieces of paper. Instead, we might have a large volume or some sort of pre-Columbian artifact that we have to get down into nooks and crannies to try and understand.
Welcome to the Pittcon podcast, where we hear from world-leading scientists about their journeys from passionate young academics to professors to Pittcon presenters. Today we speak to Dr. Eric Monroe, Head of Scientific Laboratory Section at the Library of Congress, where analytical chemistry meets cultural heritage preservation. Eric shares how a freshman chemistry class redirected him from journalism to science, leading to a career that now protects priceless artifacts, from Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence to 16th century manuscripts, using techniques like multispectral imaging and adapted GCMS methods. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how modern analytical science is uncovering hidden histories and transforming the preservation of the world's most important collections. So, Eric, it's a pleasure to have you on the Pittcon podcast today. Welcome. Before we get started talking about your work with the Library of Congress, I'd be interested to know how you got to this point, because I think that's quite an interesting place to work, because people will be like, what role does analytical chemistry have in a library? Can you tell me more about your journey?
Yeah, so my journey is quite weird. I went to a small liberal arts undergrad school where I actually entered in with a journalism, thinking I wanted to be a journalist. It wasn't challenging enough, but you had to take a physical science class. So I took chemistry my freshman year, fell in love with it, and decided that doing research was a whole lot of fun and stimulating, way more so than going the journalism route. So I didn't decide I was going to grad school till between my junior and senior year. Since then I've worked in analytical neuroscience, developing the early stages of mass spectrometry imaging for use in tissues. Then I worked in HIV for a little bit, then electrochemistry in a little bit. I just thought I wanted to be a professor. That didn't really pan out, so I ended up overseeing the characterization lab in a chemicals, floor covering, and textiles company, and realized that industry wasn't right for me. And so in order to I knew I needed to move to the DC area to solve a two-body problem and have a new crazy adventure, because, well, my career to that point had been crazy adventure to crazy adventure, crazy adventure. Was looking at usajobs.gov and found a scientist position at the Library of Congress, thought that looked cool, and thankfully they hired me. 2 years later, I was promoted into a supervisory role, and the rest is kind of history. It's been an incredible journey, and the job itself is very, very interesting, engaging, and way more fun than I ever thought it was going to be.
And the Library of Congress was established in 1800, and it's the National Library.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about the library itself, the sort of collections it has, and then your role?
So yeah, the Library of Congress is the world's largest library. We were founded to be the library for Congress. Historically, up until around 1900, we were in the U.S. Capitol building, but after a course of number of fires, Senate kicked us out. And so then we have our main building across the street, and now we have 3 on Capitol Hill, and so, as well as 2 off-site storage facilities. We have a wide range of collections. While we do have a lot of books, it is not our largest collection. We have a large number of manuscripts, including most of the early presidential papers. We have the largest collection of glass flutes because we have a large musical instrument collection, maps. We have a very large number of audiovisual recordings that are held down in Culpeper, Virginia. I'm sure I'm missing a lot more. But yeah, we've got this wide range of things. In geography and maps, for instance, we have a very large collection of pre-Columbian art and artifacts. So we have just about every kind of material you might think of that might be in a library, as a research library, or in a museum. We have some of both of those. We have large frame paintings, for instance, that are part of the pre-Columbian that I know I've seen. So we have to be, as the scientists at the library, we have to be able to be very adept at answering questions of both what's the state of a material, what is it degrading, how could it be conserved. So we work hand in hand with our conservators when that comes to play. But then we also, as the Library of Congress, we're open research library. So outside researchers will come in, work with the collections, and as well as our curators work with the collections to understand, and they're historians of their own right. And so oftentimes they will call us up and we'll be able to work hand in hand with them to aid them in understanding their collections, either how was this made, how can they interpret it, or if they find something that is concerning to them as the degradation state, is that a problem? Is that something that they need to go to conservation, which is a different division within the preservation directorate, of which I'm a part of. So we really try and adapt what we can do. We've got a diverse set of about 15 of us with all sorts of backgrounds, with a lot of cross-training, so we can, as the management team, myself and my chief in preservation research and testing, be able to adapt to our goal is to be able to adapt to whatever someone will bring to us. We should be able to answer their questions, or at least try our best to get close to that.
Yeah. And what sort of analytical techniques do you employ in your department?
Of all of the labs I've ever worked in, this is the most well-outfitted lab I have. We have 2 labs. We have our wet analytical lab, where we have things like HPLC, SEC, mass spectrometry, microscopy, pH testing, all of those kind of things, which we use largely for testing either our quality assurance testing program, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a little bit, or looking at simulated materials. So often our long-term research projects looking at the degradation there, we will make samples, and then that allows us to do destructive testing. Collections don't typically end up in our ground floor lab. That's down in our sub-basement lab, which is our imaging, microscopy, and spectroscopy labs, where we have our multispectral imaging system, we have a Raman, we have a custom non-contact audio playback system called Irene, X-ray fluorescence, FTIR, fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, microscopy, X-ray diffraction, electron microscopy with an EDS on it, and basically just about anything on the sales floor of the main analytical research tools we have. And in some cases, we have multiple, since we've been able to utilize the miniaturization of many of these devices to basically, we exploit that miniaturization to allow us to go and work better with the collections, since they're not just small pieces of paper. Instead, we might have a large volume or some sort of pre-Columbian artifact that we have to get down into nooks and crannies to try and understand.
Yeah, and you can therefore work alongside the curators better because you don't have to bring them to your lab, you can take the lab to them.
Right, we work very flexible in that. Some items are too large, too fragile, or too high of a security risk to easily bring them to our lab. So we can take a lot of what we have to them, and then even when they do bring things to the lab, oftentimes the curators and the researchers, we can get them so excited, or they're so excited that they're working with some scientists to look at the object that they've been mulling over for weeks or months or sometimes even years, that they come along and are there in the lab with us. So it's this very interesting and powerful collaboration. So we kind of oftentimes refer to what we're doing as transdisciplinary. So we might be working with an educator, a medieval historian, and ourselves as the scientists all on a single project, and they're all looking at it from slightly different ways. And sometimes these short-term, hey, what is this right here, leads to multiple questions that then leads on and on and on. And so a simple question sometimes might take 2 hours to answer. Other times it might take 2 years, because it leads to more and more interesting questions going forward, which is also a whole lot of fun for us to be able to work with the collections and then to see and understand and talk with the historians on what they are getting out of this interaction. It's almost mind-blowing whenever we see some of these big things happen.
So you mentioned GCMS. How have you adapted and transferred these technologies into the labs at the Library of Congress?
Yeah, so we really utilize, outside of 1, maybe 2 of the instruments that we have in the lab, they are off-the-shelf, commercially available instrumentation. And a lot of times what we're doing is we're developing or tweaking either how we utilize the data and study the data, how we mount the instrument to try and do sampling, or we change the way you do sampling or not sample at all. When we're working with collections, a lot of times we can't sample. And historically, people, when something is degrading, it might off-put VOCs. So the standard way prior to my time at the library about a decade ago, people were very involved in using SPME to do the sampling, either contact or non-contact. One of the things we do at the library is we also have a quality assurance of materials testing program where any material that's going to come in as far as a construction material for a storage space, a secure storage vault, or making, for instance, an exhibition case, we test prior to the construction of those spaces in order to try and minimize the risk to the collections by the materials that are going to be around the objects for some period of time.
Because there's been examples in the past where the exhibitions have been destroyed or...
Very much so. Oftentimes it's not destroyed. Back in the 70s when Audi created the Audi test, that was because, some of his coins were highly damaged by his new storage case. But even more recently, there are from time to time reports where silver might tarnish, or there are crystals that have been forming on collections or on the inside of the case. And so the goal across everyone in cultural heritage and the science side and in the development, particularly of exhibition cases, is trying to minimize the risk to the collections while they're on exhibition. So the standard way of doing that has been the Audi test, where you take a couple of grams of the material you want to test, put that inside of a beaker, expose a copper, silver, and lead coupon to that under high humidity conditions in 60 Celsius for 28 days. And you hope it comes out as it went in. Instead, you don't want to have growths or corrosion on any of those materials or changes in color, for instance. For me, that was kind of too slow, because oftentimes all these construction schedules move further and further and further, and then you kind of have to make an intuitive guess if you don't have something else. So before I came to the library, I was working at a Kimball's Floor Covers and Textiles company who is developing, one of the development projects was some materials to go into foams to go into the auto industry. So is there a standard test VDA 278 that's a direct thermal desorption methodology. So there you take a couple of milligrams of your sample, put it into a little vial, heat it up for 90 degrees C and the standard test for 30 minutes. That all gets collected onto a cold inlet on the GC, and then we can then run that, and in our system it's a closed loop, so we can see not just what comes off, but how much. And so we've been doing that for the past better part of 8 years to try and get a really good understanding and correlation between what comes off of the materials and how that turns out in an Audi test. And in some instances, we know what the bad actors are in certain of these materials. So there is a heat stabilization reagent in PVC board, or certain PVC boards, which often are used to build up the exhibition cases. We know exactly what that compound is. And we know if that compound is present and we put something that's silver inside that encasement, in a matter of months, it's going to tarnish. So that's a rapid screening test that now we can give a thumbs up, thumbs down for these PVC boards in 2 hours instead of over a month. So it's been able to help us do that. And then we can also utilize the same methodology to do air sampling. So we can either air sample straight onto a sorbent tube or into an air sampling bag, and then do to the tube and then into the TD in the lab to understand what's going on in the area surrounding our exhibits. So we can take that, we can sample from an exhibit case right before, for instance, we put the objects in to make sure that nothing funny happened during construction. If somebody comes to us and say, hey, my collection smells funny, or someone is just going in to look at a collection and they get this hit of some problematic odor, we can go in and sample from within that little storage space, even if it's just a tiny little box, to understand what's going on there. Oftentimes, like I said, the volatiles coming off of a collection as it degrades can be indicative of what's happening, and so that can inform either having to rehouse the object, segregate it from other things, or inform what conservation might need to do in order to stabilize the object going forward.
Yeah, and I understand that a colleague of yours actually introduced the same methodology at a similar time to you.
Yeah,
that was
so
quite...
the bringing of direct thermal desorption came into cultural heritage at the same time from two different directions. I brought it in from coming from industry, and then Mike Samide from Butler University and Greg Smith from the Indianapolis Museum of Art basically were using their pyrolysis unit and turning the temperature down to do the similar methodology about the same time frame. The fun part there is that I went to Butler University, and Dr. Samide was one of my analytical chemistry teachers, and when when I was in his classes, neither one of us knew that this field of cultural heritage scientists even existed. He ended up doing a sabbatical with Greg after they had some problems with some of their encasements, and so they were trying to figure out what was going on there. And so it came from two completely different ways, and since then has kind of been very well adopted in particularly the larger cultural heritage institutions as a additional way to study volatiles, as well as be able to more well understand what's going on in the ODDI test, because otherwise you're just waiting and seeing the result, not what caused it. We've done through work with the American Institute for Conservation's Materials Working Group. We've done a number of round robins, for instance, where people across the world are running the same handful of samples, oftentimes using slightly different conditions, because we all have slightly different inlets, and mine is designed for being able to do these lower temperature but much longer experiments to be able to trap more, where others, they can't trap for near as long. So if it's a half hour, 5 minutes, 2 minutes at 90, 200, or 90, 120, or 150 C, what we found is qualitatively we're seeing the same things. We're seeing the same compounds. We're seeing them in different ratios. And oftentimes I'm more sensitive because I'm able to go for longer, so I'm able to get more of those volatiles off. But across the board, we're working in saying that it's very similar qualitatively, which works out really well, because if you're just trying to say, okay, if this compound is there, no, then that provides us a mechanism to be able to do that more rapidly, more completely. And as a scientist who really likes to know all of what's going on, it makes us feel a whole lot better when we can say, okay, yeah, these are the compounds that are problematic, and build an internal database or share across the community of what might be the problem children that are at least either causing damage or at least with an elevated risk, so we can help mitigate that.
Yeah, it'd be great to chat through a couple of case studies now. So you've already mentioned that at the Library of Congress, you've got some of these, historic, important documents that were integral to the establishment of the United States as we know it today. And one of those are the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence. Could you tell me about the work you've done on that with spectral imaging, the techniques that are involved, and ultimately the incredible findings?
Yeah, so that work happened before I started the Library of Congress. So we have one of the treasures that we have in the Library of Congress is Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence. And it's 4 pages, and he has very nice handwriting, which is great to look at. And then it's interesting, it's kind of the original track changes. So if there was a change, he would cross it out and then write neatly above it the change. And in some cases, it appears that it wasn't his suggestion, so he might write in the margin that it was Mr. Adams or Dr. Franklin who made the suggestion. But partway down through the second page, there is a completely different modification. It doesn't look like anything else. And it's talking about the king has created treasonable insurrections against our fellow citizens, something about the forfeiture of property or something like that. I don't have it memorized. It didn't actually end up in the final declaration. But where it says citizens, it looks like there's a smudge underneath it. So it's different from anywhere else. So when we're going through and doing the multispectral imaging, where we have a series of LED lights that allow us to illuminate the collection object in very low light, but small wave bands of light, and collect with a high resolution black and white camera. And so as you're looking at an object, as the LEDs progress from UV through the near IR, different materials and chemicals in the pigments, for instance, will interact differently. So we get this data cube in black and white, and then certain aspects fade in and out as we would progress through and looking at that data cube, for instance. And by looking at some of those different wave bands, you could start to separate between what was underneath citizens. And so by doing some computation, we're able to separate that out. And what he had originally written was our fellow subjects, which is, if you think about it, a very different meaning for that sentence. A historian had actually found reference to this, and it was that Jefferson had been copying or working with the Virginia State Constitution, which had been released a couple of weeks prior, which does use the phraseology that the king has created treasonable insurrections against our fellow subjects. And Jefferson writes that he wrote that, but then realized it wasn't right for our country going forward, so he expunged it, never to be seen again, and then we go ... until as meddling scientists come along a couple hundred years later. And so that's one of those things where we're able to utilize some of the techniques and technology that we have in our lab, and mass spec or the multispectral imaging has been a very valuable tool to be able to understand things and uncover things that have been redacted or have faded over time, for instance. But the music people, for instance, really like us when they have paste downs of composers. They might be working on something and decide they don't like that. They might just paste down over top. So we can separate out these layers of text using these techniques to be able to better understand or help them better understand what the person who is making these documents and developing over time, what they were thinking. So it is able to very much change that interpretation of the collection itself.
Yeah, it really shows that ideological shift that was happening in real time. It shows it happening in real time, which is
and in this
fascinating.
case, it was literally, and so it's all appears to be the same ink. So it would have been done in real time, where he basically was just a smudge and trying to remove that and then write neatly over top as best as he possibly could.
Was the fact that it was the same ink challenging then?
It made it a little more. It lessened the guarantee for success. When we have something that, for instance, was very old and it's iron gall ink, and then someone comes over with a black Sharpie later, that's much easier because they're completely different inks. They respond very differently under different conditions. But I've been amazed in seeing what's been able to go through there, and with the advancements in computational tools and the increase in the number of wavebands that we're collecting now tends to work out incredibly well.
Yeah.
And we also then use that as a mechanism, as a starting point for a lot of our other analyses, where if that can't tell us what's going on, it can help us identify points where we can then use our other spectroscopic non-contact tools to then go in and try and figure out what's going on. Even if they were slightly different iron gall inks, for instance, we can use XRF to look at the minor components in the iron gall ink, which are just contaminants, but they come in with the vitriol, which is just an iron sulfate rock that is ground up. So it has all sorts of other minerals in it. And so oftentimes that can help tease apart what's going on just by looking at the different levels of these different materials.
Yeah, and now going to a completely different type of artifact, which is the subject of your talk here at Pittcon. It's an ancient, well, not an ancient text, but a medieval text. Is that right? Can you tell me more about it?
Sure. So 16th century prayer book. It's
Yeah.
only this big.
Right.
Well worn. Has all of these paste downs, including one in which it's been removed for later use.
Okay.
In this time period, that is common. If you look at the flyleaf of the inside of there, that's an older parchment even.
Okay.
It's as if you would use, some other printed paper that you don't need anymore. It's just something they have. But yeah, then there's this one which is the Veil of Veronica.
And that's the thing.
This is the one that
we were interested
was
in. Yeah.
Really interested by the curator.
Yeah.
And because this is what the cataloger wrote, which is basically that the artist chose the wrong materials and it's basically destroyed itself over time. So that was the question.
So what we're looking at in this prayer book is there's an image of Jesus, and the pigment that's used is black.
Yeah. So it's an image of Jesus from the Veil of Veronica story. So signs of the cross. He's going to be crucified, and Veronica comes, wipes the sweat off of his face, and his face then transfers to that veil. It's one of the holy relics. And so we were asked to look at that to see what was going on.
Yeah. And what sort of techniques did you use?
So we did the multispectral imaging, microscopy, fiber optics reflectance. So here's where the MSI doesn't really work, because blacks are black and blacks are hard.
Yeah.
But if we look under the microscope, you can see there's two different blacks on the face. There's a shiny and a non, and then there's the nimbus, the halo, which is a different gray.
Right, okay.
We can use FORS to look at iron gall ink and verify that. Then XRF was our bread and butter
Yeah.
to identify most of the other pigments but then the face was still crazy because all we saw was silicon titanium, which isn't colored. We then went back to the curator, and we found a small sample that had flaked off to the other, or some transfer, and a piece that was flaking off. So we were able to make a sample to do XRD and Ramanan to get the answer, which was intentional. And what we think it's doing is replicating the pilgrim badges. So this is what the veil looks like today, or tens of years ago.
Right.
It's completely black.
Yeah.
But it is at the Vatican. And so the take home is, with this is we think it's this,
Right.
which would be cool because it says that this is a memento, not a mistake. But at the same time, these were nuns from 16th century northern Germany who were cloistered. They weren't going, it's very unlikely they were going on these pilgrimages to Rome. So we think it's instead a memento of a spiritual journey.
So I understand that the prayer book was owned by some nuns in northern Germany. Can you tell me more about the historical significance of the document and then the research that you did on it?
Sure, yeah. So it's a very small prayer book. It wasn't just owned by, it's done in two hands, all in iron gall ink. So it's probably made by these two nuns as a working document. It's still in its original binding, so the cover is well worn from use. So it wasn't just they were copying and it sat on the shelf. This was a working component of their spiritual time in a convent in northern Germany in 16th century. It's interesting in that as it goes through the prayers, there are a number of images that are pasted in. Oftentimes they're square and partially colored in. There's at least one place where it looks like there was one of those and it was taken out later and probably repurposed in some other volume of one of the nuns. That was commonplace back then. The interior leaflet of the cover, for instance, in this one is a completely obtuse different piece of parchment, but that was common then, just as if it would be if you needed to take a piece of paper that you printed out and you were just going to throw it away. It was just something that was there. Another weird thing and interesting thing in looking at medieval volumes or trying to track where those pieces came from, but that's a completely different story. But there are all these paste-ins, but there was one that the curator was particularly interested in. When this item came into the library 50, 70 years ago, something in that time frame, the cataloger writes in the catalog that it's unfortunate what happened to this paste-in and insinuates that the artist chose a completely wrong palette and it's just completely graded over time because he was like, it's unlikely that the artist would have chosen to make Jesus' face entirely black. So the curator came to us, she's a medieval historian, and came to us and wanted us to look at this and say, okay, is this a problem? Is it degrading? Has it degraded? Is it something that needs to be stabilized by conservation? Or is something else going on and the cataloger was just wrong? So the first thing we did was we did our multispectral imaging on it, and blacks are hard, but it did suggest that there are a number of different black inks. The handwriting iron gall ink was different from that, which is on this small pasted in medallion of the face of Jesus from the Veil of Veronica, which has some iron gall around the edge. It has some black around the hair. The face is a different black. And then the nimbus is also blackened. And so we looked at that. It gave us a good mapping point for different places in which we really had, where we knew we wanted to look with our other spectroscopic non-contact methodologies. So we do no harm, basically, is always the goal in working with the collections. So we also put it under the microscope, and we could see very easily that there were two different grays on the face. The hair is not shiny, it's just a black line. By eye, it looks like iron gall ink of some sort. The face, however, is a slightly different shade of black. It's a little more gray, and it's shimmery. So it's really interesting to look at a microscope and just kind of move the microscope around a little bit. It definitely shimmers. And then the nimbus is also a bit shiny, but is also gray. So we then looked at fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, in that allows us to look from the UV into the near IR. We use that a lot to look at the organics. It's also a really good ability to give us markers for iron gall ink. So we got a wonderful signal for the iron gall ink that's written in the main text. The hair and the face, however, gave us very flat signal. Was unusual. If we were able to, when we kind of increased the intensity by about a factor of 10, just blowing it up so we could zoom in on it, we could see that the line around the head, the hair, had some of the characteristics of iron gall ink. So that kind of indicates that there's iron gall ink, but maybe something else present there that might depress that signal. But the face was almost flat. It's almost like we had carbon black, but it definitely wasn't carbon black. So this is how a lot of these processes go. We start with one thing, add layer upon layer upon layer of analyses in order to get towards the answers. So the next step was XRF. So we've got a micro XRF. It's a 100 or 200 micron spot size, which enables us to get down to very small portions of these works, which is important when we're working with ink lines, or in this case, something that's the size of a quarter, and we're looking at 5 or 6, 7 different places that are of importance. And we want to get multiple spectra from each of these kind of areas. In doing that, what we saw were there are multiple iron gall inks. We see different vitriols. This is from the main ink on the page, and then portions around the paste in. There's some iron gall ink there. The hair looked like iron gall ink as well, but the face was completely different. There, all we saw was silica and titanium. Two materials that A, don't make any sense as being a pigment, and B, definitely wouldn't change color over time, which means that this was likely intentional. Now the nimbus is something entirely different. We saw silica, or the nimbus was something that was entirely different. There we saw silver and sulfur over top of a heavy ground, so that makes sense, and it would just signify that it was silver leaf that is tarnished over time. So that's with our spot analyses. And so while we took several spots even from the face and still saw the same, just silica and titanium, we also have an imaging mapping XRF. And so in doing that, we found it's also very useful because it provides a visual representation across the object that connects very well with the curators and the researchers. And so in doing that, we're able to map the medallion itself, and we saw all of the materials that we thought we would see with around the iron gall ink of the hair, with the addition of lead. So it suggests that was iron gall ink mixed with lead or overpainted on a lead or something like that, which we know that can depress our force signal. So that makes sense. That's great. In addition, their tiers are lead white. In addition, we see aluminum and sulfur in the red around the halo, which is indicative of a Brazil wood lake, which kind of verifies what we saw with the fours. I didn't talk about it, but we saw it, which is great. Mercury for the lips, so you don't want to kiss this Jesus because it's vermilion. And then there's azurite is the blue. That's a mark on the nose, and then surrounding there. So we're still flummoxed of what this face could be. We're just like, it appears as if it has to be intentional, but what does it mean? And first and foremost, what is it? So we made a decision. We needed to go back, and we wanted to look at the volume again, sitting down with the researcher and the curator in this case, and went back with portable microscopes so we could zoom in and look at it. And we saw on the opposing face that there had been some transfer of some small particles that had self-sampled and flaked off of the main material, and then another larger spot that was coming off. And so we're allowed to take that sample from the transfer to allow us to do X-ray diffraction on it, which told us a lot of what it wasn't. It wasn't any of the normal minerals that contain titanium, which we kind of expected because in the interim we had bought in a bunch of titanium-containing silica materials, and none of it, the ratios matched. So kind of we ruled a lot of that out, and it was just another way for us to say, okay, yeah, this isn't what's going on. But it said that it was quartz and calcite. Okay, so there's the silica, and it could have a titanium contaminant, and that's what we were seeing, but that's still not a grayish black. So what could it be? Thinking back to the 4s, okay, what if it's carbon? So we can take that same small sample, put it into our microscope Raman, and lo and behold, we found hits for quartz, calcite, and carbon. Okay, so it still doesn't make sense on why it was used as a pigment, but now we at least had the chemical answer. So now goes that back and forth that there's no way we would have been able to come up with the rest of what's going on. We rely on our historians and our curators and our researchers for this part, but it was a lot of interesting back and forth, and what Mariana found was reference to pilgrimage badges. So the Veil of Veronica is one of the holy relics. It's held at the Vatican. And in the 16th century, it would have been it was a major point of pilgrimages. So just as you do today, if you go on an adventure, a vacation, people come back with trinkets so they can show, hey, I went to this place. That's nothing new. So particularly for the Veil of Veronica, a lot of these badges were made of pewter. So what we think is the face is black, not just to emulate what the veil looks like today, or even possibly back then it might have been dark, as some of the representations of the veil are also quite dark. But why would it be shiny? We think it's trying to emulate the pewter pilgrimage badges. But this was a prayer book for nuns, by nuns, in 16th century northern Germany. They were cloistered. They weren't probably going on pilgrimages to the Vatican to see this. So what we think is that this is not just a rote prayer book where a new nun is coming in and is copying a previous nun's prayer book, but instead it's very possible that this was a working document, and instead of just writing in the prayers for the Veil of Veronica, it is instead that, like others who could not afford to go to pilgrimages, they would remove themselves from society for the time it would take them to make that pilgrimage. And so this could be her ruminations while she's taking her spiritual pilgrimage. And upon completion of that, the High Holy Nun could then be giving out these badges to basically put in her what is effectively her prayer sticker book. So that again changes the interpretation to now this could be a living, breathing document that documents this nun's spiritual journey in 16th century. So it goes from, hey, this is bad choice of materials, to it could be a working document that explains and gives some insight into a nun's spiritual journey, 400 or 500 years later.
Mm-hmm. It brings so much life and context to an object that feels so far removed from us today. But once we've done that analysis, it just brings it to life. That's an incredible story. And like we said, that is the talk that you gave here at Pittcon. Mm-hmm. How important is Pittcon for catching up with collaborators and connections and making new ones?
Really great for me. Cultural heritage field is very small. I've been coming to Pittcon since somewhere around 2002 when I was an undergrad. And my entire career I've been coming back. I have some lifelong friends that I've met here who've helped me through my career. I've then turned around and helped them through their career, even though they're 15, 20 years more experienced than I am. So meeting up with old friends, the breadth of work that is done here is very helpful for me. I can go into biologically relevant talks, and I'm seeing what people are doing, and then my mind's going, how can I adapt this to use in my lab? Going through the expo floor, it's one of my favorite games when I've got an idea for something I need in the lab to expand our capabilities, and going up to vendors and they go, well, what do you do? Well, I need that so I can answer these questions of materiality of a 15th century pre-Columbian artifact, for instance. The veil story I just told, the imaging XRF, for instance, of that one, that was the first collection object we put underneath the beam. We did it during the install. So it's getting ready to be published, and our field service engineer is on our acknowledgements because, well, we had this thing. And so A lot of our engineers really like to come out and play with us, and some of our service, or particularly our salespeople, find what we do very interesting. And because we're really just trying to adapt modern instrumentation to understand collections, it's really, the collections are phenomenal. They're of great historical value. Sometimes we just have to think of them as samples. Now, they're samples we can't often touch or destroy, but so we have to be careful on that side of things. But we really are looking at how can we take cutting edge technology, take what it was meant to look at, tweak that slightly, and how can we apply that to our otherwise typically pretty obtuse use case.
Yeah. And moving from history to the future, what's next for you in the Library of Congress going forward?
A lot of the same, probably. It seems like we're being asked more to do a lot more outreach. We have all of these stories, and I think now there are more people, particularly in the library, are starting to understand that we have these stories that we can tell. I find great interest and great excitement in working with the collections with researchers. So I'm hoping that we can start to have more people at the library understand that they have this capability, and it's just a phone call or an email away. It's nothing big for us. We don't have our own collections outside of a small set of research collections that we use for our long-term research. But being able to improve that, which then will lead to more outreach and interactions, and showing people how STEM can be utilized in a library in a way that they could probably never expect. That's one big side of the things that I would be interested in. We have a large undercurrent of long-term research projects that both look at degradation mechanisms of materials in our collection. So we have our own research collection, basically, of from this that we maintain, that are not part of the library's collection, but we can do destructive testing. We have 1,000 volumes from 1500 to 1850. That was a collection that was collected in the 1970s by a guy named Barrow out of Virginia. When he shut down his lab, it came to the library. So he collected to understand how paper degrades. So we're taking that mantra and creating our own reference pieces. So we've got audio tape, we've got wax cylinders, we have LP discs, we have all sorts of papers and parchments, and trying to get the materiality of the collection into there so we can then study it. Not only as it degrades over time, if conservation needs to try to treatment, we'll work with them for that. But then that also allows us to then think about what other questions might we want to answer with those materials, and then do what I was talking about with identifying what techniques we might need to bring into the lab, or how can we adapt what we have in the lab to address those. So that's kind of our long-term research projects. And we also run programs where we're doing short-term research with conservation. So if they're getting ready to do a treatment, they might ask us to identify the pigments, the binding media, the status of the substrate, so they can develop their treatment plans so they can remove stains or treat stains and not lift up the stain that is the written text of a founding father, for instance. That would be a bad day. So we have those are 3 of our 4 components that we do. We also have a large quality assurance program. I alluded to that with the volatiles work, but there we test every material that will come in contact with the collections during housing, as well. So that's our traditional quality assurance program. So we have specifications that materials must meet. So we test all of those before contracts are awarded, and then every time an order is made off of those contracts, we test those materials to ensure that they're meeting the specifications and aren't going to provide undue risk. Think about all of the stickers that might go on an object. We order them tens or hundreds of thousands at a time. Every now and again, we see that the adhesive is changed. Our supplier doesn't even know that the adhesive is changed. But if we catch that and saying this would cause an undue risk or could damage the collections, we can stop that at the butt. So that's going to be another ongoing thing there. We're developing all the volatiles to be able to understand that, and then applying that to exhibition case design and development. Is very valuable for us as the library is in the midst of a complete renovation of the museum-like side of the forward-facing museum style side of the library. So we're doing a lot of work now looking at materials going into exhibition cases and exhibition design, what goes into those cases, and how can we best preserve the collections doing that. So we're busy. We've got this large breadth of materials and tasks and programs. Just keep going, and then trying to then understand how we can best, I think, share what we do. The preservation side of things we do, it's more academic style when we have peer-reviewed papers on that. The Veronica was getting ready to go out as a peer-reviewed. So trying to share what we do more, both internally, externally, with the public. So last year and this year, and hopefully going forward, we're being involved with the science fair component of our local Comic-Con convention. So this year we're talking about some work we did with Rare Books, a elementary school science teacher who is on sabbatical at the library for a year, developing some interactive exhibits for the new Young Readers Center, The Source, and our scientists. So it's this three-ring circus that kind of came together that is being used, we studied the pigments that went into this volume. It was in 1705. And now the teacher is taking that and is developing an interactive where we'll be able to show, okay, here was the original, here are all the pigments that were there. Here are the twigs, sticks, berries, and rocks that she would have used to make her watercolors. And showing that whole story about how artists back, particularly far in the way back when they were hand coloring everything, what was that process? And so that's going to end up being an interactive and possibly an interactive card at the library. So trying to get more broad impact, I think, is a lot of fun. It's something we've always done, and it seems now that we're being seen more on that front. And so that's one of those things that I think can be of great value, and we're finding it's a whole lot of fun and stimulating for us to work with as well.
Yeah, well, you sound incredibly busy, but I wish you all the best with it. I'm particularly excited about the outreach side of things because I think these stories are absolutely fascinating and people should know about them. So I'm really glad to have featured some of them on the podcast today. So Eric, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.